The parties at Frank Sinatra's Faralone House were legendary. Dean Martin would be at the bar mixing drinks that were more alcohol than mixer. Sammy Davis Jr. would commandeer the piano, playing until dawn. Peter Lawford would work the room with his Kennedy family connections, making introductions that could change careers or end them. The pool would be full of starlets and showgirls, the living room packed with studio executives and men in dark suits who never gave their real names. And somewhere in the middle of all that calculated chaos would be Marilyn Monroe, trying to smile through the medication fog, trying to be the goddess everyone expected while dying a little more inside with each performance. But here's what the Rat Pack mythology never tells you. When the last guest stumbled out at 4 in the morning, when the staff finally finished cleaning up the champagne glasses and cigarette butts, when Sinatra had moved on to his next engagement in Vegas or New York, Marilyn would often still be there. Alone in that beautiful glass house, surrounded by luxury but drowning in isolation, she would wander from room to room like a ghost haunting her own life. The Faralone House represented everything Marilyn thought she wanted: mid-century modern sophistication, proximity to power, a place in the inner circle of Hollywood's most untouchable men. But what it actually provided was something far different, a gorgeous cage where she could hide from the world while slowly losing herself to the prescription bottles that multiplied in every bathroom, the phone calls that went unanswered, the dawning realization that Frank's protection was really just another form of control. The architecture promised transparency with all those glass walls, but the reality was maximum visibility with zero escape. Everyone could see Marilyn, but no one could reach her, and she couldn't reach out. Before we go deeper into what really happened behind those walls, please subscribe to our channel. We uncover the hidden truths of Hollywood's golden age, the stories that were buried beneath glamour and mythology, the reality behind the legends. Now let's step inside the Faralone house and discover what Marilyn Monroe experienced during those lost days in 1961 and 1962. The Faralone House, sometimes called Birdview, sat like a modernist jewel high in the Coldwater Canyon hills above Los Angeles. Built in the late 1940s, the property embodied everything that mid-century California architecture aspired to become: clean horizontal lines, walls of glass that dissolved the boundary between interior and exterior space, cantilevered sections that made the structure seem to float above the hillside. When Frank Sinatra first rented the property in the late 1950s, he immediately recognized its value not just as a home but as a statement. This was a stage set for the performance of power, a venue where Hollywood royalty could mix with political operatives and underworld figures in an environment that felt both exclusive and inevitable. Sinatra maintained his rental through the early 1960s, using it as his party headquarters, close enough to the studios to be convenient, but isolated enough in the hills to provide genuine privacy. The approach required navigating narrow canyon roads that made surprise visits nearly impossible. Security could easily monitor who was coming and going. For a man like Sinatra, who valued control above almost everything else, the Faralone House was perfect tactical architecture. He could throw legendary parties and know that what happened in that glass fortress would stay there unless he decided otherwise. The staff were loyal, well-paid, and bound by non-disclosure agreements. The guests understood that discretion was the price of admission. And the architecture itself created a paradox: maximum visibility during parties when everyone wanted to be seen, and perfect concealment afterward when the evidence needed to disappear. Marilyn Monroe first came to the Faralone House in the spring of 1961, during those desperate months after her divorce from Arthur Miller and her psychiatric hospitalization at Payne Whitney. She was rotating between several of Sinatra's properties, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home. The Faralone House became one more station in that restless orbit, but it held particular significance because of what it represented. This wasn't just Frank's house, it was his party headquarters, where Hollywood's most powerful men gathered. When Marilyn was invited there, it felt like acceptance into the ultimate inner circle. The first time she saw the property, Marilyn was overwhelmed by its beauty. The approach through Coldwater Canyon, winding up through the hills with Los Angeles spreading out below, felt like ascending to some modern Olympus. The house itself represented a kind of sophistication that was different from the ornate Hollywood mansions of an earlier era. This was the new California, the modern vision of luxury that didn't need guilt or grandeur because it had perfect taste, perfect control, perfect integration with the landscape. Marilyn saw in the Faralone House an aspirational elegance that seemed to promise that if she could just belong here, everything might finally be okay. But that initial impression of sanctuary would curdle quickly. The glass walls that seemed so beautiful during the day became something else at night, transparent surfaces that made her feel exposed and vulnerable even when she was alone. The open floor plan made it impossible to find a corner where she could hide, and the parties revealed themselves to be performances that required more energy than Marilyn had left to give. The Faralone house parties followed a predictable rhythm. They usually started in the early evening, with A-list celebrities arriving first to establish the energy. Then would come the studio executives, the producers, the politicians looking to maintain their Hollywood connections. Later, younger starlets and models would arrive, and occasionally the men in dark suits would appear, the ones with Italian names and Vegas connections, whose brief presence charged the atmosphere with a different kind of electricity. Sinatra would hold court in the living room or by the pool, orchestrating these gatherings with particular genius. Dean Martin would work the bar, mixing drinks with casual expertise. Sammy Davis Jr. would eventually migrate to the piano, transforming the party into an impromptu performance. Peter Lawford would circulate, making introductions, facilitating conversations, creating the social alchemy that made Sinatra's parties feel essential, and Marilyn would be somewhere in the middle of all this controlled chaos, trying to play her part. She understood what was expected: be beautiful, be charming, be the Marilyn Monroe everyone came to see. But by 1961, that performance was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. The medication she took to manage her anxiety made it hard to stay focused. The alcohol everyone pressed into her hand compounded the pharmaceutical fog. The sheer energy required to be on for hours was draining her faster than she could recover. Other guests would notice her distraction, the way her eyes would glaze over in conversation, the way she'd excuse herself to find a bathroom where she could take more pills or simply hide from the relentless demands of being Marilyn Monroe. But the party machine didn't stop for anyone's discomfort. The music kept playing, the drinks kept flowing, and Marilyn kept performing until the chemicals in her system reached a tipping point and she'd have to retreat to one of the bedrooms, leaving the party to continue without her. The people who worked at the Faralone House during Sinatra's rental period accumulated knowledge about what really happened there that would never make it into gossip columns. These were the people who cleaned up after the parties, who found the evidence of excess and desperation that morning light revealed. They saw the empty prescription bottles Marilyn left in bathroom cabinets, always different names on the labels because she was getting pills from multiple doctors. They found glasses of champagne poured but never drunk, cigarettes lit and then forgotten. They discovered clothing discarded in strange places, suggesting movement through the house that wasn't quite coordinated. One housekeeper who worked at the property throughout 1961 later told an interviewer that Marilyn had a particular habit that spoke volumes about her state of mind. She would write notes to herself and leave them scattered around the house, reminders of appointments, fragments of thoughts, sometimes just her name written over and over, as if she was trying to convince herself that Marilyn Monroe was a real person rather than a performance she could no longer maintain. The housekeeper would find these notes tucked into books, left on countertops, wadded up in trash cans. Most were mundane, but others were more revealing, fragments that exposed the desperation beneath the glamorous surface. The staff also witnessed the aftermath of parties in ways that complicated the Rat Pack mythology. They saw Sinatra's frustration when Marilyn became too incapacitated to function. They saw other guests taking advantage of Marilyn's compromised state, engaging her in conversations she wouldn't remember, touching her in ways that crossed boundaries she was too medicated to defend. They saw the casual cruelty of a social world that valued Marilyn as a decorative object, but had no patience for her as a damaged human being needing genuine care. And they saw the morning after, when Marilyn would emerge from whatever bedroom she'd collapsed in, hollow-eyed and disoriented, trying to piece together what had happened while the staff cleaned up the evidence of a party she could barely remember attending. The Faralone House was designed according to principles of mid-century California modernism, the belief that architecture could transform human experience, that transparency and openness were values to be pursued in physical form. The architect had created something genuinely beautiful, a structure that seemed to float above the hillside, with walls of glass that brought the landscape inside. During the day, the house was filled with light. At night, the view of Los Angeles created a sense of being suspended above the ordinary world. But for Marilyn Monroe, those same architectural features that were supposed to liberate instead became instruments of confinement. The glass walls that brought the outside in also made her feel constantly exposed, constantly visible. Even when she was alone, she couldn't find a corner where she felt truly private. The open floor plan made it impossible to escape from one room to another without being seen, without having to maintain some version of the performance, even in her most desperate moments. The transparency that was supposed to represent honesty instead felt like a constant demand to be visible, to be available, to be Marilyn Monroe, even when the woman beneath that performance was collapsing. Late at night, when insomnia and medication made sleep impossible, Marilyn would wander through the Faralone house like a ghost. The staff who worked night shifts would sometimes find her standing at those floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city lights, her reflection ghostly in the dark glass. She would be wearing one of Sinatra's robes, her hair uncombed, her face stripped of makeup. In those moments she looked small and lost, a frightened woman trapped in a beautiful cage, unable to find the exit no matter how transparent the walls appeared to be. What made the Farralone House particularly significant during 1961 and 1962 was its role as a meeting point between Hollywood glamour and political power, with organized crime lurking in the shadows. Peter Lawford wasn't just social, he was married to Patricia Kennedy, making him a direct connection to the president and the attorney general. When Lawford brought other members of the Kennedy circle to the Faralone House, he was facilitating introductions that carried real political weight. The conversations that happened weren't just celebrity gossip, they were negotiations, information exchanges, the kind of backroom dealing that shaped policy and elections, and Marilyn Monroe, moving through these gatherings in her medicated fog, was absorbing all of it, the names, the connections, the casual references to things that were supposed to remain secret. She had already met John F. Kennedy at various Hollywood events, and there were whispers about a romantic involvement. Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General waging war on organized crime, was also part of these social circles, creating a situation where the people he was trying to prosecute were sometimes in the same room. FBI surveillance of Sinatra's properties, including the Faralone House, intensified because agents recognized that something significant was happening, some kind of convergence between Hollywood, Washington, and Vegas that could become a major scandal if fully exposed. Marilyn's presence made her a witness to things she probably didn't fully understand, but that made her dangerous nonetheless. She heard conversations she wasn't supposed to hear, saw people together who were supposed to be enemies, and everyone knew that Marilyn, when heavily medicated, had a tendency toward indiscretion, toward saying things she shouldn't say. This made her both valuable and vulnerable. Valuable because her presence signaled inner circle status, vulnerable because she represented a potential exposure risk that could destroy multiple careers. There were periods during 1961 and 1962 when Marilyn Monroe would effectively disappear into the Faralone house for days at a time, present but not visible. These episodes usually happened after particularly difficult nights, a party where she'd taken too many pills, a phone call that had left her devastated, a confrontation with Sinatra. She would retreat to one of the bedrooms, close the door, and simply shut down. The staff would bring her food that mostly went uneaten. They would check on her periodically to make sure she was still breathing, still responsive enough to be considered alive rather than in some kind of pharmaceutical coma. During these lost days, Marilyn's grip on reality would become increasingly tenuous. The combination of barbiturates for sleep, amphetamines to wake up, and various tranquilizers created a chemical cocktail that made normal consciousness nearly impossible. She would drift in and out of sleep, unable to tell whether hours or days had passed, whether she was dreaming or awake. The Faralone house, with its disorienting glass walls and open spaces, amplified this confusion. She would wake up not knowing which of Sinatra's properties she was in, how she'd gotten there, or who else might be in the house with her. What disturbed the staff most was Marilyn's isolation. Even when the house was full of people, Sinatra entertaining guests, parties in progress, Marilyn would remain locked in her room, separated from all that activity by nothing more than a door, but completely unable to participate. She could hear the music, the laughter, the conversations, but she couldn't summon the energy to join them. And no one came looking for her, no one knocked to check if she was okay, no one seemed to notice that Hollywood's biggest star was decomposing alone while the party continued without her. This was the brutal arithmetic of Sinatra's world. You were valuable as long as you could perform, but the moment you became a burden, you ceased to matter. Decades after Marilyn Monroe's death, the Faralone House has changed hands multiple times, and with each sale, the mythology surrounding the property has grown more elaborate and valuable. Real estate listings emphasize the celebrity pedigree and historic Hollywood connections, using coded language to suggest that something significant happened within these walls. When the property went on the market in 2023 for $17 million, the listing photos showed pristine mid-century modern architecture, carefully maintained terrazzo floors, that iconic pool with its view of Los Angeles. But what wasn't in the photos was any acknowledgement of the darker history that these were the rooms where Marilyn Monroe spent some of her most desperate hours. The buyers who circulate through the Faralone House during showings are often aware of the Sinatra connection, might even know about the Rat Pack parties, but they rarely understand the full implications of what happened there during 1961 and 1962. The real estate agents emphasize the architectural significance, the celebrity associations, the aspirational lifestyle. They point out where Dean Martin tended bar, where Sammy Davis Jr. played piano, where Frank Sinatra held court. But they don't mention where Marilyn Monroe lay unconscious after taking too many pills, where staff found her wandering disoriented, where she stood at those glass walls feeling trapped despite the transparency all around her. That version of history doesn't sell houses. Every new owner of the Faralone House inherits not just the property, but also the ghost story, the legend, the unanswerable questions about what really happened during those lost days when Marilyn Monroe was there. Some embrace this history, seeing it as part of the property's value, evidence that they own a piece of Hollywood mythology. Others try to ignore it, preferring to focus on the architecture and the view and the status. But the history persists regardless, because the house itself has become inseparable from Marilyn's story, from the larger narrative of how Hollywood treats its most vulnerable stars, from the ongoing fascination with beautiful women who die young and leave behind mysteries that can never be fully solved. It would be too simple to say that the Faralone House killed Marilyn Monroe. She died in her own home in Brentwood on August 4, 1962, not in Sinatra's rented property in Coldwater Canyon. But the pattern of behavior that led to her death, the pharmaceutical dependency, the isolation masked as glamorous socializing, the inability to find genuine support within a circle of people who claimed to care, was established and reinforced during her time in Sinatra's orbit, including the days and nights she spent at the Faralone House. This was where she learned that refuge could be a trap, that protection could be control, that the people who seemed most powerful were often the least willing to use that power to actually help someone in desperate need of saving. The Faralone House represents a particular kind of Hollywood tragedy, the beautiful space that witnesses suffering but offers no real shelter, the glamorous gathering place that isolates rather than connects, the architectural masterpiece that becomes a cage despite all its transparency and openness. For Marilyn Monroe, properties like the Faralone House were way stations on a journey that had no good destination, places where she could temporarily hide but where she also lost more of herself with each visit. The parties were exhausting performances, the glass walls made her feel constantly exposed. The luxury that was supposed to represent arrival instead felt like a prison with very expensive furnishings. What emerges from the fragments of evidence about Marilyn's time at the Faralone House is a devastating portrait of a woman who was simultaneously hypervisible and completely unseen. Everyone could see Marilyn Monroe, the hair, the figure, the face that launched 1,000 magazine covers, but no one could see the frightened, damaged person beneath that performance, and no one with the power to help was willing to look closely enough to recognize how desperately she needed saving. The Faralone House was complicit in this failure. It provided the stage for Marilyn's decline, facilitated her pharmaceutical dependency, enabled the isolation that would eventually kill her. And now, decades later, it stands as a monument to a particular kind of Hollywood cruelty, the way we celebrate spaces where tragedy occurred, turning them into valuable real estate while forgetting the human cost of all that glamour and mythology.